You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Hello, this is Dana Cowan, and you are listening to the Progressive Hedonist Podcast. I'm incredibly excited today to be talking about trash. I want to know how, in this world, we can make cocktails out of things that we would otherwise discard. And I have an expert in this topic today with me, Kelsey Ramage. Kelsey, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
I have loved watching everything that you do in the trash cocktail zone. And I would love to know, first, how did you get interested in cocktails?
I think I left home at 18 or 19 and I moved to Toronto, and that was to pursue a fashion career. And I started working in a nightclub, which was horrible. But there was a supper club, and there was a daytime or an evening time aspect before it really got crazy. And there were a couple of people there that I sort of looked up to, and I kind of always wanted to get on the bartending side. And, a few of them made me a couple of cocktails. I got behind the bar by the time I was 20, 21. Drinking age in Canada is a little lower, a little younger. And I just really enjoyed it, the pace and the atmosphere and getting to talk to people. And that's kind of when I just started being okay, maybe this is for me. And then, I graduated from school, and I think a lot of people in this industry, I still kind of missed it once I was working 9 to 5 at a desk job. And so I decided to go back to it, on weekends. And then the weekends slowly started to fill up the week. And then, I quit my day job.
And what led you down the road of sustainability?
I kind of grew up in a house where, I was in a very rural town. My mom kind of instilled different things with me. She would be canning, every fall when it was the end of season, or, midsummer when stuff was in season. We always recycled and composted and all of that stuff. So when I ended up moving to the city, inevitably, because I didn't want to stay in Salmon Arm, I just found that the systems were a bit more difficult to navigate. In London, once I moved there, the systems were virtually non-existent. And really, the city recycling system was overloaded completely, especially working in a hotel where there is a lot of waste. We were just looking around this is crazy. This is absolutely nuts. And this is just one hotel on South Bank of 100. So it was a bit of an eye-opening moment, but I think that was kind of where it all started for me. It was our industry is a little bit broken in this way.
And when we think about trash in cocktails, at first I was like, what do you mean trash? What is the trash and how voluminous is it? Can you give me a sense?
Yeah, I think, everything that we get, especially in the first little bit when we were starting the company, people thought that it was out of the trash, which it's not. It's definitely fresh waste. It's things that we were basically seeing that, in the restaurant industry, there was a big movement with chefs of fruit or nose to tail type of cooking. And that was, more cost effective for them. But we weren't seeing that mentality was being translated on the bar. When you're coming up as a bartender, you're trained to learn all of these classic recipes. Well, all of those classic recipes that date back to Jerry Thomas days use the same ingredients. They use the same species of lemon, lime, orange, grapefruit. Most of the countries that are creating cocktails are importing fruit from all over the world that's the same damn thing. So what we wanted to do was kind of look at what a bar already had within its four walls as waste products to see what we could then make out of that.
So what did you find? What was there?
Honestly, we toured all around the world, and this is kind of where we discovered that there was a hugely broken system, that, a lot of bars were using the same thing. So you'd go into a bar in Chile and then into a bar in Tokyo, and they had the same thing. But we were finding obviously lots of lemon and lime rinds, coffee grounds. If we didn't find enough waste products within the bar, we would go to cafes and restaurants that were in the area to try and find stuff. Like old pastries is a big one. Avocado stones is another one. Things that people associate with garbage, trash.
Let's just take coffee grounds for an example. Like, what is a cocktail that you can make with coffee grounds?
So spent coffee grounds, especially if they've been, like the coffee's been extracted with heat, they release their oils. And if you're not careful, they do become toxic. So we use them as like a light infusion. We'll just like infuse something with coffee grounds. So like a simple syrup that's just got this like little bit of coffee back note. It's really nice in like an orgeat, or like, infusing a little bit of Campari to do like a coffee-inspired Negroni.
That sounds so good. And what about banana peels? Banana peels are apparently kind of a miracle ingredient.
Yeah, they have tannin for sure, which can actually be frozen out if you like chuck them in the freezer and then take them back out, and they get really brown and like kind of awful looking. They really contain a lot of banana flavor still. So we've done like a long infusion with them, or like a sous vide type of infusion, and it really like cooks down the flavor, adding a little bit of sugar to that. It's a dark colored banana syrup essentially with a tiny bit of tannin.
It does seem that the lemons and limes are a lot of what you would encounter. And so what are the best ways to use those?
So we tried to basically reduce the amount of lemon and lime juice. This was our whole thing. And it works better with limes, definitely, than with lemons. So we would do basically kind of like an oleo.
And what is an oleo?
So like soaking the husks in sugar so it extracts the oils, or we'd blanch them. So we do a combination of the two. And blanching them just kind of extracts the oils really, really quickly, get a little bit of bitterness from the pith, and then we'd use that in combination with the oleo, and then added a little bit of citric and malic acid to that to mimic the acid profile of what lemon or lime juice in this case would be. So then you can use that liquid in combination with your lime juice and reduce the amount of limes that you're buying.
And were you reducing the amount of limes partly for cost, but also partly to reduce ingredients coming from far away, because most of these places don't grow limes?
It was both. I had a cocktail bar in Toronto that closed just during the pandemic, but we tried to bring everything in from within 100 kilometers of the bar. The few things that we didn't, we were really mindful of how much we were using.
So tell me about that, because I know about ingredients coming from within 100 miles for restaurants. Again, yes, that's something we've heard of, but I haven't heard of a bar trying to do that. What were the challenges, and what was the most exciting thing about that?
I mean, it was very challenging because we were in Toronto, and that's like under snow cap for 6 to 8 months of the year. So what we did was like we turned to things that were dried, so like roots and bittering agents and different herbs, and then we also turned to things that grow in the sea. So like different seaweeds to add like a salinity or like a texture. It became this like learning experience for not only myself but like the staff as well, where they'd go and find different things that were either did grow in the winter or things that they could like put down in a huge quantity in season so that we'd have it, 6 to 8 months later as like an infusion or a liqueur or a fermentation or any one of those things that we kind of use for traditionally that humans have used for hundreds of years to preserve food before refrigerators. We turned back to that kind of stuff.
What did it do in terms of reshaping the bar menu?
So the menu, we all had to, less so for Ian and I because we'd done it for a long time, but more so for the staff. It was like kind of reteaching them how to come about creating a cocktail. We would get them to like start by researching what was available or what we already had in-house, and then kind of build your cocktail back from there. And then the very last thing that you end up adding is the spirit. So you're coming at it from, what do I want this to taste like? And then what spirit would pair well with that. So you're kind of thinking about it a little bit backwards. But from a guest perspective, like just because we'd list the cocktails the same way any other bar would, the spirit and then the flavors and the la la la. So it's not like it's not so polarizing. And we also wanted to make sure that, if people wanted to come in and have a daiquiri or a margarita that contained lime juice, that we would still be able to do that. So I didn't want it to be like super polarizing for folks.
How important was teaching to your guests?
We tried not to be, preachy about it. I think talking about sustainability can be difficult because it's like, you don't want to be like, well, you should do this and you should do that. Well, it's just so like, it's deeply personal, I think, and it's deeply regional. And so, if people wanted to like, they were having a big group of guests and they just wanted to come have a good time, like order off the menu, we don't care. But if they were like interested or, asking questions, we'd drop the cocktails with like what we would call drop calls. So, you'd have your one-liner, hey, this is a blah, blah, blah. Or like your two-liner, hey, this is this, and we get it from here. And then there's the three-liner where it's like, here's the story and how we came about this. So I think it was like training the staff also on which drop calls to use and then making sure that information was really readily available to them.
I don't know if the Trash Tiki was crazy or not, but can you tell me about the Tiki Tour and what the foundation of that was?
Yeah. So we, it kind of happened so organically. I came back, I just finished this cocktail competition for Altos Tequila. I came back and we planned one little pop-up in London. I think what catapulted it all was that we got asked by Dan Barber to be the beverage directors for Wasted. We were tasked with having to find enough ways to feed cocktails to 150 guests a night or whatever it was. And that became a challenge because there was you would go to grocery stores because obviously we were there must be, tons of grocery store waste. It's the number one food waste producer. There was a lot of legislation around how that stuff could be used and where it could go. And a lot of the times it was legislated that it had to go to landfill, regardless of whether it was usable or not. What we were using was usable, obviously.
Was tiki the style of cocktail that you were doing? And tell me about tiki.
Yeah. So we decided that because neither of us had a background in tiki cocktails. I have always liked tropical style drinks. I think they're really fun. We wanted to tackle one of the more difficult styles of drinks, I think, to make sustainable. The reason for that is there's a load of garnishes on the top and all of that usually gets thrown away. And then all of the ingredients usually in classic tropical cocktails are, very, very similar. So we wanted to kind of challenge the boundaries of that. And I know that in modern tropical style drinks, they're definitely pushing the envelope a little bit more and having a little bit more fun with it. But in the style that we wanted to do, we wanted to emulate a more of a classic tropical style drink. And that's why we decided to tackle that.
And I was reading there's things you can do with pineapple pulp, right? That's one of the garnishes. Talk me through that. What do you do with some of those leftover garnishes? Or do you eliminate the garnishes?
We had just eliminated them. If we could stuff a pineapple frond in the top, that was probably the extent of it. Or if we were we would dehydrate a lot of stuff or dehydrate and then grind up and make a powder or a leather. That was kind of the extent of our garnishes. So we didn't really go into many of the over the top, but we wanted to also show people that it could still be fun and interesting and cute and not be wasteful.
So what are the combinations of the classic tiki cocktail?
We used a lot of pineapple. When you're juicing a pineapple to make pineapple juice, there's leftovers is the skins, the pulp and the core and the fronds. So kind of the whole thing.
A lot of the pineapple left.
So using the skins gives a green kind of note to cocktails. And then using the pulp to create a syrup is really easy. And then using the cores chopped up to make it a tepache alongside the skins with the pulp. You can kind of ferment that whole thing and create this really delicious fermentation. We were also using a ton of spices. We would use avocado pits to make an orgeat or usually what's used in an orgeat is almonds to make an almond syrup. So
wait a minute, can you replace almonds with avocado pits? That would be amazing because almonds are just the worst. But I love that you can use an avocado pit.
Yeah, so they are edible. We didn't realize this until we were in Mexico, and they were like, "Oh, my grandma used to make a tea out of these." So yeah, you just like kind of toast off. There's a little shell, which you definitely want to like discard because that's where the not good stuff lives. But then you just grind them up in a blender like you would almonds, or like, rough chop them and then give them a toast. It's the same process, and then you soak them in a simple syrup, give them a flash blend, and strain it out so it's the same.
I'm going to try that. I will let you know how that goes. That sounds like a lot of work, but I mean, I suppose if you're going to do it, like, would you follow the same process with an almond? I mean, I guess you wouldn't make orgeat from scratch necessarily.
A lot of places still, prep an orgeat the classic way, and we just applied the same recipe that you would make a classic orgeat with to avocado pits. But I will say that like the flavor profile is different.
And it sounds like that's something that you did and discovered in Mexico. Were there other regionally specific waste challenges and solutions that you came across?
Yeah. So when we got to, I think it was Colombia and Chile, exactly, and Peru, we just noticed that there was like such an abundance of local produce. And I think that's when we stopped just using waste products, because we were like, a lot of the bars that we were getting waste from are classic cocktail bars that like were using the same ingredients. And we were like, no, we want to learn about what's growing here. Like, let's use some of the local produce. So some of the bartenders there like took us to one of the local markets, and we tried stuff that we'd like never tried before and got to learn about how they use it and, incorporate it into some of our drinks. And it was a really wonderful way to travel. So we just kind of changed the way that we did cocktails from that point onwards. We're like, no, we're not just using trash. We're going to like really dive in with somebody locally and kind of learn about what's growing and when and why.
It's obviously completely aligned, right? I mean, staying local, using local ingredients similar for your, the 100-mile radius for your bar. I went down a lagoon hole with the Black Lagoon. I need to know all about the Black Lagoon and goth and drinks. I didn't know it was a thing. I didn't know there were goth bars. Tell me about, first of all, where your love of goth comes from. Let's start there.
My business partner, Erin Hayes, and I don't know, just like growing up and like being in my early 20s and like running around Toronto, there was a huge goth bar called the Big Bop. And it was like right in this like seedy area. It was like 3 stories. Like the thing was huge, and we'd go there and see whatever punk rock shows, or like I was in like a bit of an emo phase at the time. And, we were just like going to these kinds of places. And what we noticed, we only became friends like maybe, I don't know, probably 8 years ago. I say only, but we weren't friends when we were younger. We both had the similar experience where it was parallel. We were going, she was in Chicago, I was in Toronto. We were going to these little places. And then we got a little bit older, and all of these places had closed down. They all went out of business. There wasn't so as much of a calling for them. And it was kind of sad. We were like, well, they're all gone.
Can you describe the scene at one of your Black Lagoon parties? Like, what does it look like, and what drinks are you serving?
Yeah, they're so fun. They're like completely immersive. We kind of try and have a hand on everything. So like the playlist goes from everything from like the Cramps early night to like more heavy metal goths towards the end of the night. There is usually in most of them a life-size coffin that you can stand in. It's like, there's blood splatters on the walls. There's like body parts hanging everywhere. Everything is black and purple, and like the lighting is like black lights and green. And then like the cocktails are really themed out. Like we have, little custom, there's a little mermaid mug, and then we've got this like creature for the Black Lagoon that's like this little guy that you can have cocktails in. So it's like, everything's kind of in touch. It's like going into one of these old school tropical bars, but it's just like, instead of being tropical, we've been called Tropigoth. It's like this new genre of tropical cocktails and experiences that, we're Tropigoth.
That's completely new to me. And the cocktails have great names, and they're bloody. What are some of the cocktails?
We did one called Siren Song this year, and that was in the mermaid glass. So that was like a tropical whiskey cocktail with Lot 40, which was a lot of fun. We did one called Memento Mori, and that was a black cocktail, obviously. So it's like an espresso martini with mezcal and like banana and a bit of sherry. It was so delicious. They're just like, they read delicious, and then the names are just a lot of fun.
I want to tell you about one of the supporters of this podcast, Planet Forward. What they're doing is really cool and aligns with the mission of Progressive Hedonist. Planet Forward is dedicated to creating a regenerative system for consumer goods. What that means is that they're working with sustainability leaders to reach their climate goals by helping them measure and reduce their carbon footprint. Planet Forward has a software system and a team that's working with iconic consumer brands to analyze their emissions, suggest changes that help reduce emissions, and then chart a path to being net zero. Check them out at planetfwd.com to learn more about their work to decarbonize the consumer goods space. I, for one, am really excited about their work. When you think about people making cocktails at home and trying to sort of make no-waste cocktails, what should people be thinking about first?
If they're specifically trying to make a no-waste cocktail, is just like look at what you already have in your fridge. Like if you got some rubbery carrots, nobody's going to notice that they're rubbery once they're juiced. I think a lot of people like panic and they're like, oh my God, everything has to be so fresh. And like, that's not the case. The wonderful thing about making cocktails is that it's going to wind up as a liquid. So nobody cares about what it looks like at the start. But the other thing is like, I think the easiest thing for, people making drinks at home is to source out spirits that you love that are produced sustainably. And that's such a fun thing to dive in on. There's such a wealth of information available online in terms of how spirits are produced, and like things like Novafogo Cachaça and like Kopali rum and some of these ones that are just like so delicious and so good for cocktails at home. That's where I like starting.
I'm really interested in understanding, like if I'm looking at any spirit and they tell a sustainability story, how do I make sure that that sustainability story is true?
Yeah, there's a lot of greenwashing out there. I'll be quite frank. And it's like a nauseating amount of disinformation. What I look for usually is like, if there's an article or like directly on their website's usually the best spot, but that's also information that's coming from the distillery. They're not going to lie on there. They're going to leave out information. If they say, oh, we're like lowering our water usage and like actively trying to lower our carbon emissions without saying exactly what they're doing to do that, like, what are you doing? I don't know. No one else knows. So what I like doing is like, they've installed solar panels. They are capturing rainwater. They are, giving their waste to local agriculture to like feed cattle and pigs, or, there's just like a lot of like little things. And a lot of it is different from distillery to distillery. Like, because sustainability, like I said before, is so regional. It depends on where they are and also how much money they have to be able to put these systems in place. But it is kind of interesting to like, once you do find that information, to be able to read up and be like, oh, that's really cool that they're using like, the side of the hill to like get rainwater from the top to the bottom and then distilling with that, which is like creative things that a lot of distilleries are doing.
And what about organic ingredients versus not organic ingredients? Like,
I mean, there's not a lot of distilleries that are using regenerative farmed or raw materials, which is kind of sad, but also a lot of times organic is considerably more expensive to buy. So I kind of sit in the middle with it. I know that there are some distilleries that actively support their farmers, and like, Absolute, for example, has its own strain of wheat that grows naturally a little bit better in the climate that they have. So they're able to use less fertilizers and pesticides. So like learning about that side and then realizing that for a really small distillery, it might not be entirely possible, but as long as they're like doing something in terms of like where their stuff is grown, because like all spirits are agricultural products. And I think people forget that they all have to support farming. They all have to like be mindful of where things are coming from and how they get there. So the more I like hear about this within our industry, I think it's just like this small group of distilleries that are doing it right now. And I would like to see that a lot more. But I think that we've still got a long ways to go in that regard.
You began to shout out a couple of them. So I wonder if we can go by like spirit category. And if not, that's okay. But, is there someone in the gin category, vodka category, scotch?
The one gin that stands out to me is Bar Hill. They are supporting local bee colonies. Yeah, so they're pretty cool. It's like this delicious like honeyed gin. That is the only gin that's like coming out at me right now. But I do know, Absolute Vodka. Bar Hill also makes the vodka. If we're going in the rum category, Kopali is really amazing. There's actually a lot of different rums that are doing sustainable practices. Tequila is a really difficult one as well because agave harvesting can be problematic in of itself. They are monocultural farms inevitably. And then a lot of, the prices fluctuate, and the things that they can control, things like supporting the farmers while growing during like the 5 to 7 years that they grow the agaves for is really important. And not just kind of like buying it on the open market for whatever price it's going for. I think that's a really important thing. And also a very, very interesting thing is that there are also pollinators when it comes to agave. They're bats. So usually the agave gets harvested before there's a quiote, which springs up and like produces a flower and little seeds, and then the agave dies. So usually they're harvested before that happens. The part that helps the bats is that quiote that springs up. So that's kind of problematic. So if they're allowing a certain number of their agaves to go get to the quiote point, and then that kind of helps support the bat populations that live amongst the trees surrounding the agave farms, which is kind of a cool thing.
Completely fascinating. So you've traveled the world, as we've said. Can you give some shout outs to like your favorite bars around the world?
There has been a lot. Yeah, Alex Francis was running Little Red Door in Paris at the time, and they were using exclusively like French produce, which was really, really cool, and doing very, very cool things with it. And like, it felt like, they'd do something with apples and you'd be like, I've never tasted apples in that way. I will say that they have since left Little Red Door to open up their new spot, which hasn't opened quite yet. But that's very, very exciting, and I'm super excited to go see what they're going to do with that new space. So in Toronto, it was actually a good friend of mine from London. He was living in Manchester at the time and was running a very cool bar over there. He moved to Toronto and opened up a bar called Mother, Massimo Zutti. Massey, we all call him. He's like such a wonderful, kind human being. And Mother, they are fermenting a lot of things and using shelf stability as kind of like their way of going about cocktails creatively, which I found very inspiring and very cool. Those are kind of my tops. There's also like here in LA, Thunderbolt, which is like amazing. And I didn't realize this until I was like actually in the space. Thunderbolt is purposely using less ice than most programs as a way of like reducing their water usage. So they only have a crushed ice machine. And crushed ice uses less energy to produce ice because it's smaller.
What do you think the impact of climate change is on cocktails now, or that you can see in the foreseeable future?
I really hope that more bartenders are more conscious, become more conscious of where things are sourced. I did this like thing where I was giving like a talk to a bunch of bartenders, and it was really cute. Like they were all really engaged. And I just asked the question, who all is ordering from one of these massive produce companies like Cisco or whatever. And all of them put their hands up. So everyone's ordering from these massive produce companies, and not a lot of them. I was like, well, who all knows where the produce is coming from, like which country? And they were like, no one knew. I would love to see small farms and things that are grown locally become more accessible for a commercial large scale bar. Once we bridge that gap, I think that we'll have a lot of problems for both the bars trying to source things side and for smaller farmers that are not producing things in a monocultural style of farming. I think that that's going to help everyone involved.
I was in the podcast with two questions. One is there a word when you think of the change you want to see? What is that word?
Wow. I think two words kind of come to mind, and I think it's accessibility and simplicity. Simplicity is probably the bigger one. I think that there needs to be a movement back towards how we used to do things when things were less accessible. That means, like even one generation ago, where you're talking about like your mother, your grandmother, where you go to a grocery store and it's like that's the stuff that was grown around the area. There wasn't this like globalization of food systems that is so prevalent right now today. So I think that there needs to be a level of simplicity, and it needs to be more accessible for folks. It needs to be easier than like hunting around a grocery store, trying to find what is local. We need to like have that accessibility, have that simplicity of being able to get things in people's hands that are sustainably grown, that are locally grown, and that financially support the people around us.
Couldn't agree more. And the very last question is, if you're going to make the perfect climate-friendly or local sustainable, take your pick of words, cocktail, what would it be? And can you give me the recipe?
I really, really love mandarins or tangerines. They're like my favorite thing. So what I started doing was this brandy cocktail that has like brandy, a little touch of sherry, mandarin juice, and then like a little bit of mandarin oleo. And that is the only thing that's in it. It's just like so simple. You don't need any extra citrus. It's already got the acidity. It's got a little bit of like sweetness balance. You can also top it with a touch of Prosecco, which is super delicious.
Well, I'll toast to that. Thank you so much for joining me on Progressive Hedonist. I love having you. And I'll be in LA in the dead of winter, so maybe I'll get to see them.
Yeah, so thank you so much for the chat.